Good morning, everybody. Dear Vice Minister, dear speakers, dear members of the board, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning. With Cecilia Wikström, our chair of the board, we are joining our voices to welcome you today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you at EIPA, celebrating the 40th anniversary of our institute. Today we are around 50 people in this room, but we have over 300 people joining us online. This is the first major event since almost 2 years when the pandemic started. So in a sense, we see this as a victory to be able to be here today with you, and despite all the challenges we had to make it happen. As we are celebrating an anniversary, it's a tradition to look back to the past, to the achievements made over the years by our institutions. These are extremely numerous, and I will not go through all of them for sure. But let me just share one number, 500,000. 500,000 people we have trained over 40 years. This is massive, this is impressive. This is even, I think, a bit underestimated. But this number demonstrates the impact EIPA had on EU administrations across the countries and across EU institutions over these 40 years. EIPA over the years has grown from nothing to quite a substantial organization, thanks also to the work of my predecessors. We had antennas in Belgium, Italy, Poland, Spain, Luxembourg, and obviously here in Maastricht. But we even had an office in South America for a few years, as we had a project for the European Commission. And we trained people all across the Mediterranean, also for a few years with the META project. So I would like to thank my predecessors for the great work they did over the years before me. I mean, I'm there for only 2 years. They've been there 38 years before me. So that's most of the work, I would say. I'm there for a little piece. Most of them couldn't join us, unfortunately, today. But we have the pleasure and honor to have among us Stefan Skeppers, the founding and an honorary Director General of EIPA, who is still connecting with me on a regular basis and a good source of inspiration, I should say. Thank you, Stefan. I'm looking for you. I saw you before. I'm looking for you. Okay. So EIPA was created with the idea and the mission of helping European administration to manage the challenges of European integration. Very practical and pragmatic mandate, intended to bring civil servants together to understand each other and grow Europe. This mission has not changed and is still driving our endeavors. Today, building bridges between theory and practice, building bridges between EU institutions and countries, building bridges between EU member states, and even further in the world. While the mission hasn't changed, the world around us has been changing over 40 years. It's actually changing faster and faster. I joined EIPA 2 years ago, and it was clear that we had to reassess deeply the way we fulfilled that mission for the years to come. Unfortunately, 3 months later, the crisis started. And it showed us the need for change was even more stringent for us, for our members, for the society in general. I will get back to it, but I would like also to thank all the collaborators of EIPA for the months, the work they have been doing during this month, changing the institute in depth, adapting to the new reality, thanking them for the dedication and commitment. Without them, that would not have been possible. So thank you to all the staff. Now, most important, I would like to look to the future and the topic of today, making European policies work, next generation EIPA. We have gathered 3 distinguished panels of experts who will debate and bring some light on how to address multi-level EU governance work through various perspectives in this changing world. The recent events have definitely made the need for improvement very stringent in EU-level, multi-level administrative systems. For managing the crisis itself, but most important, the recovery plan the EU member states are planning to put in place. The resilience and recovery plan is probably even a larger challenge than the management of the crisis itself, and will require a terrific commitment at all levels of administrations and beyond. Personally, with over 20 years of business and digital transformation in the private and public sector, in industrial settings, in legal services, I am a strong believer what matters the most is the people. They are the drivers of change. I mean, yeah, obviously you have processes, finance, technology. These are important, but they are enablers. People matters first. So I'm going to talk about these people. So our administration are facing a level of complexity they never faced before, calling for much more flexibility and adaptability. And let's synchronize it. This is not what most of our civil servants have been recruited, trained for, and confronted with during their careers. This is not a requirement for the short term, for a few weeks, for a few months. This is for the long term. It will stay there. So how are we going to handle it? How do we make sure we have the right skills and mentality with people taking the ownership of the plan? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves. We need to have in our administrations people who think in terms of adapting, improving things, and have that special mindset when unusual events happen. We also need a new type of leadership who will drive the teams, a new way of doing things, a new style. We see things moving in that direction, with more and more countries, public administration, turning to us at EIPA on how to adapt new ways of selecting the personnel, recruiting, evaluating, training, and promoting people. Not later than yesterday, we had a discussion with one of our member states about these topics. Let's just don't take two examples, simple example, of changes that would definitely help moving ahead. First one. Traditionally, the public sector has been recruiting based on knowledge. Very little on adaptability, how to adapt, find solution, and this is what we need, and this is what we need urgently. Rethinking the way public administration recruit is an important element, but not sufficient, as the need for new skills is there now. So we move to the second example. In most places, the public servant's career is pretty closed, leaving little space for externals coming in, essentially from the private sector. At this moment, the recovery plan is in deep need to bring urgently new experts. For example, change management people. Do we have the right incentive to attract these people, to make them stay? Asking the question is probably answering it. Probably not. More broadly speaking, a stronger cooperation and collaboration and bridges between the public and private sector is highly advisable in my view. And that will help along many dimensions. One example is innovation. I'm a strong believer in developing public, academic, private sector, multi-industries innovation ecosystems. I will not go much further on that topic because that would take a lot of time to discuss. So we'll get back to the people's skills. So when I look now also to other initiatives that are taking place, and especially in terms of cooperation between member states, I see the initiative taken by the Portuguese presidency to start a public servants exchange program across member states. That pilot is going to be launched beginning of next year, and at EIPA we are working on it with the Portuguese and the French colleagues who will take over when they start their presidency. So this is extremely important to create the bridges between the people in different administrations, in different countries, sharing culture, and when something happens, they can talk to each other, making things happen in a better way for the citizens. This being said, the roadmap for EIPA future is quite clear. More than ever, we are committed to assist leadership and workforce of EU member states to make this transition, adapt ways of working, adopt new skills and new methods. We will fulfill this mission by teaching and driving research as we did for many years, but also reinforcing our advisory and technical assistance capabilities, and most important, changing our own methods, bringing people together, sharing experiences across borders, disseminating knowledge and best practices in person, but also with the help of technology for which we have invested heavily over the last months. The challenges ahead are enormous, but we are ready to tackle these with strength and decisiveness for the years to come. This ends my speech. I thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a very enjoyable conference. I will now introduce Professor Alexander Stubb. Professor Stubb is the director of School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence since May 2020. He has an impressive academic and political career, serving his home country, Finland, and Europe as member of the EU Parliament, member of the National Parliament, and multiple minister and prime minister positions from 2008 till 2015. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics, a master's degree in EU Administration from the College of Europe in Bruges, and a BA in Political Science from Furman University in South Carolina. He also studied French language, culture and civilization at the Sorbonne in Paris. Professor Stubb, it's an honor to welcome you online. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. EIPA, in other words, the sort of past 30 or 40 years, not least because I remember in the 1990s working with Edward Best on a book on the Amsterdam negotiations and later on the Nice negotiations, and lovely to see all of you there today, albeit virtually. Now, what I will do in my allotted 25, 30 minutes is basically to try to give an overview of the past 30 to 40 years, but try to look into the future. And I'll do it by basically giving an introduction, then 3 points, one from the 1990s, one from the 2000s, and one from the 2010s. And then I'll conclude with a couple of observations where I think we should be looking into for the next 10 years of the existence of both the European Union and of EIPA. So by way of introduction, I think we human beings have a tendency to do 3 things. Number one, we over-rationalize the past. In other words, we look into the past and think that something happened according to a certain pattern, when in real life it was probably much messier than what we make it out to be. Second, we have a tendency to over-dramatize the present. In other words, every news day is a new day for a catastrophe. And we sort of get immersed into this constant flow of information and think that the world is about to end. But at the end of the day, we actually muddle through quite well. When we over-rationalize the past, number one, over-dramatize the present, number two, number three, we end up underestimating the future. And this is where I think that EIPA and the work that you've been doing over the past 40 years comes in. You're sort of able to, how would I say, see the woods from the trees and understand the bigger picture, pause, reflect, look for lessons from the past, don't over-dramatize the present, and give policy advice for the future. And that's why I've always enjoyed the work that you have done. Now, my starting point for trying to analyze the European Union is always to keep in mind that the European Union is a process, not an end state. Integration in one area leads to pressure to integrate in another one. There is no such thing as a finalité politique. And that's why I think some people have a really hard time being involved in the debate. They don't understand that, you know, we're not looking at some kind of an end federal state or end intergovernmental state. This is a process. It's basically, you know, public management of public goods on a transnational and multilateral, multinational level. And I think my final observation here for the conclusion, for the introduction, is to say that I think we need to stop thinking about the European Union as some kind of a utopia, some kind of an end state where we live in a perfect world. I think in many ways it's a constant battle, and that constant battle is based on a set of values which the founding fathers established in the 1950s. And I think those values are still very valid, but of course all the time under attack. So we're talking about human rights, fundamental rights, freedom, equality, liberal democracy, and the rule of law. And we're seeing those being attacked from left, right, and center at the moment, from inside the European Union, and also from outside the European Union. But if we keep this picture in mind, that this is not going to be an end state, this is a process, it's not a utopia, but it's based on a certain set of values, I think we already get quite far. Point number one, the 1990s. This was really the up and coming time of EIPA, and I feel particularly close to that time, not least because at the time we were witnessing the end of the Cold War. A country like Finland was able to join the European Union. And for me, the 1990s was very much about consolidation. And if you take a pendulum between state and market, it was very much about market. If you recall, it was the end of socialism, end of communism. And at that time, we were able to consolidate, but the thinking was very much about market. So basically the state was put to the side. It was about integrating East with the West. Then at the same time, the 1990s for me was very much about enlargement. Of course, Finland, Sweden and Norway actually failing in a referendum. But with this enlargement was also the kick to get in the Central and Eastern European countries with time. And I think the funny thing here is with the human brain, we have a tendency to forget that this is probably one of the biggest disrupting factors to an organization that we've seen in recent memory. But the European Union was able to absorb, able to integrate. Of course, it was also a big battle about institutions. The Maastricht Treaty, where you are, was a follow-up from the Single European Act, which was then followed up, of course, by the Amsterdam Treaty in 1997. So it was about institutional consolidation of enlargement and the end of the Cold War. And of course, no policies were perfect, but at the end of the day, I think it was able to push through. So the 1990s was very much about the end of the Cold War, about institutional consolidation, about enlargement, and of course about a strong belief in the market. It was about four freedoms, competition policy, trade policy, creating the euro. It was liberalization. And in many ways, you could say that it was a very neoliberal agenda as well at the time. And Edward will remember that. And if not, we can go back and have a look at our book, what we wrote at the time. My second point comes from the years 2000. Now, for me, 2000 was a continuation of the institutional reforms. Of course, with failed referenda going back and through, we had the Constitutional Convention, we had Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, we had the failure of the Constitution, which then became the Lisbon Treaty. But again, it was all about these big institutional reform, treaty-based reforms. So, when we came to the years 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, we had basically been either preparing, negotiating, or ratifying a new treaty in one way or another for the last, say, 20, 25, 30 years. And I think there was this sort of distinct feeling of fatigue of institutional reform at the time. Of course, not with everyone, but with most people. And I think we're still on that back burner in many ways as we start moving in and are in the debate about the conference on the future of Europe. Now, if we look at the whole package in 2000, I think it was, of course, about absorbing enlargement. But there was one or two events that started to swing the pendulum of market versus state towards the state side. The first one was an externality, which was, of course, 9/11 and the whole notion of security and how we should deal with that. And then the second one was, of course, the financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, which kicked off with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in August, September 2008. So at that stage, we didn't know it yet, but we would start seeing the shift from market towards a state. Now, as we move to my third point, 2010s. That's when the sort of three big crises of the European Union came to the fore. And they were very different in character, and at the same time they were dealt with very differently. So crisis number one was the financial crisis, which turned into a euro crisis. I myself was in government from 2008 to 2016. In Finland, I joke around that immediately when I started in government, everything started to go sour. Right, we had the war in Georgia, we had Lehman Brothers, financial crisis, the euro crisis. But then, of course, came the silent crisis in 2015, and then the COVID crisis starting in 2020. So we had this sort of, triple effect of crisis hitting us. And they were very different in nature, but one sort of common theme that they had was that again, policy was centered away from the market towards the state. Of course, in the financial crisis, it was very much about a blame game. And by the way, I put this in parentheses, but I wonder what the North-South divide had been if the first rescue package had been given to Ireland and not to Greece. End of parentheses, because that's pure speculation. But the bottom line is that there was a distinct feeling that we had to start regulating the financial sector. And therefore, we moved into, obviously, first the ESM, then banking union, et cetera, et cetera. I argue, actually, that we would have never achieved those changes in an intergovernmental conference, but due to the crisis, we're able to, for all intents and purposes, stretch the rules and come up with solutions to a difficult situation. Now, the asylum crisis, I think, in many ways was not more serious, but more difficult. And I remember when many of my colleagues who were seasoned politicians had been in politics even through the end of the Cold War, they were saying that this was the first time that they really felt helpless. When you have 1 million people roaming around the highways of Europe and we're not really knowing why this is happening and what can be done about it. But again, it sort of reinforced this feeling of bringing up barriers. And also, without us knowing it at the time, there was very much a sense that, you were moving into a world of haves and have-nots, benefactors and losers of globalization. Because, of course, the financial crisis was very much put into the corner of the banks, the capitalists and globalization, and the bailouts. And kind of then, the asylum crisis as well. It was an encroachment on a lot of people's identity and made life, I think, complicated. Little did we understand it at the time. Of course, there was talk about it. But there was this feeling that, is this sort of eternal success story, end of history, the European Union really doing its job. And of course, then in 2016, we were hit by a double whammy, which was the Brexit referendum in the UK and then the election of Donald Trump. All the while, the emergence of different types of populist movements. I myself was in government from 2015 to 2016 with the True Finns here in Finland. Again, a populist movement which became mainstream because of its popularity, but very much with an anti-globalization, anti-Europe, anti-immigration agenda. So we were starting to see sort of the institutional seams of the European Union being challenged and attacked. And of course, we still, live in that. Again, there's a move from market-based thinking towards state-based thinking. And of course, then the nail on the coffin, if I may, in this sort of triple crisis was COVID and COVID-19. Nail in the coffin in the sense that right now we're very much in a non-market-based thinking, but I'll come back to that in my conclusions. Now, with these three crises and the types of policies that were created around them, it's quite easy, to conclude and say that, the crises were very different. In many ways, you can say that the financial crisis was self-inflicted. or at least self-generated. We leveraged our own crisis, if you will, by not sticking to the rules. The asylum crisis was not self-made, but it was something that also divided the member states. And the division was naturally quite geographic, because asylum seekers come from the south most of the time, unless they were used as human shields in the east, as Finland had with Russia. So the bottom line here is that there was this sort of feeling of uncertainty and insecurity. But then the COVID crisis was different. And here, if I may make the argument, that I think this was probably the best crisis the European Union has ever had. And of course, I'm not saying it's over. I think we did season one in 2020. 2021 is season 2, and 2022 will be season 3. We don't know where it's going to end. But for all intents and purposes, let me just give you the example of the success of the COVID crisis, and especially the way in which the Commission dealt with it. So there are two elements to it. One is the economy, and the other one is health. On the economic side, if you look at what the European Union or Brussels did or Frankfurt did in the span of 4 months, it's mind-boggling. First, there was the ECB's PEP program, which basically ensured and guaranteed that the markets would not collapse. Secondly, there was the EIB's investment program, 25 billion euros. Thirdly, there was the conversion of the ESM from a financial mechanism to a health mechanism. Fourthly, there was the Commission's SURE and trust programs on unemployment, etc. And then finally, of course, there was Next Generation Europe, which is the biggest financial/fiscal package that the European Union has ever seen. All of this was negotiated pretty much in 4 months. Compare that to the original ESM. Remember that if you take Next Generation Europe, we're talking 1.7 trillion, but if you look at the rescue package, about 750 billion divided between loans and grants. Now compare that to an 80 billion leveraged bazooka of the ESM. That took 4 years. And this 1.7 trillion basically took 4 months. So what I'm trying to say is that the European Union was not only swift, but actually quite courageous in doing it. The reason for the facility of it is that everyone understood from the beginning that, this is a serious problem, this is a common problem, and we can't really blame anyone with it. We're all in this boat together. So the Commission took the leadership, I think, after 2 or 3 weeks of soul searching, and then did its job. Not only that, we come to the second strand, the health part. And here, again, kudos to Ursula von der Leyen and her team. They took the risk of procuring vaccines, did the negotiations, ended up getting a lot of crap for it early January 2021. But once they had procured it for a good price, once CRISPR technology had given us the oxygen to create the vaccine, they started rolling it out. And they made a promise at the time that by the end of August, early August, 70% of the European population would get a double vaccine. And sure enough, this happened. Not only that, Europe was the most vaccinated continent in the world. At the same time, it was the biggest pharmacy of the world, and at the same time, the biggest exporter of vaccines, over 1 billion doses to 150 countries. And I think this is a huge achievement. Now, are we going to see member states thanking the European Commission? Great job. No, we're not, because that's not in the nature of things. Everything that is bad comes from Brussels. Everything that is good is thanks to me. But this is sort of the catch-22 of working in the European Commission. But my point here is that I think Europe did a really good job with the crisis, with the COVID crisis. And of course, it still continues. There's no question about it. But again, my argument is that the financial crisis, the asylum crisis, and the COVID crisis, they are strengthening the role of the state towards or par rapport to the markets. So this is my analysis overarching from almost the beginning of EIPA to today. Now, here's where I then come to my conclusion. In other words, if I have over-rationalized the past and over-dramatized the present a little bit, I will now hopefully not underestimate the future. And I'll give you three conclusions. Conclusion number one is that I think we're witnessing a change in the economic model, not only of the European Union, which has been market-oriented, if I may, social market-oriented capitalist, as I said, competition, antitrust, for freedoms, trade policy, liberalization of the internal market, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing a shift now towards more regulatory frameworks, which of course means more work for EIPA, among other things. We are seeing a shift towards a Keynesian understanding of fiscal policy, an understanding that state intervention and stimulation of the economy is okay. We're seeing a shift in the thinking on debt levels, which of course were created in the Maastricht Treaty for a certain purpose. At the same time, we're seeing a shift in the thinking on inflation. And it'll be really interesting to see what kind of a debate we end up having on the Stability and Growth Pact in the coming months. We're already starting to see the embryo of it. I just personally hope that the member states don't get stuck in the old world, and especially not in the old world north versus south, fiscal prudence versus less fiscal prudence, growth versus austerity. We have to get away from that debate and think about the economy, I think, more holistically. You might be saying that, well, Alex, hold on. You were foreign minister and prime minister and finance minister and pushing the austerity line. Yes, that's true. But I'm also the first one to admit that, new realities exist, and therefore we have to live with new realities. And of course, I'm not accountable to the Finnish voters anymore, so that makes life a little bit easier. Instead of having a black and white answer, as I always had to have in politics, in academia, I can just say, well, it depends. So we are seeing a shift here in the economic model and also in the basic thinking. I don't know where this is going to end. I really don't, but I do find it a fascinating source of analysis. My second conclusion, apart from the economic side, is that we're also seeing a sort of a change or a shift in policy focus, right? And here I'm speaking naturally about, the megatrends that we're dealing with at the moment. So climate being one. And let me add on to this that Europe always needs to have a big project, right? It's internal market in the 1980s. It's the euro in the 1990s. It's institution in 2000. Then it's crisis management in 2010s. But now it's very much climate, and with climate, of course, comes issues linked to the environment, issues linked to sustainability. And the interesting thing I see here again with the Commission, I've always said it's not the Commission President that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the Commission President. And I think we're seeing that. We know that climate was going to be on the agenda, and they pushed it really hard. Fit for 55 obviously is going to be very controversial. Taxonomy is going to be controversial. So there's no question about that. But again, this is the first continent that is putting its mouth where its money is, or the other way around. So as we move towards COP26, there's only one continent which has said, okay, these are our targets. We want to be carbon neutral, say, by 2050. And this is the way we're going to do it with 13 pieces of legislation. We, of course, understand that legislation is not enough. It also requires investment and it requires innovation. But the bottom line is that Europe is trying to do something about it. So climate is the first sort of policy shift. The other one is, of course, tech in a broad sense. I mean, if we look at the digital revolution, it's changing three things. It's changing the economy, the way in which we work. It's changing politics and the way in which we communicate. And it's changing science and the way in which we are as human beings. But tech is very much in the focus and in the center here. And linked to this, of course, issues to data, where the Chinese have a completely different understanding of centralizing state data than we do, or the Americans of privatizing data than we do, because for us it's all about data for the individual. So we have really interesting mega trends in terms of policy focus that we keep on dealing with, and I actually think Europe is quite well placed to deal with those issues. Now, of course, you're going to hear the constant criticism that we're so far behind China on AI or the US on anything tech related. Yeah, but I don't think we should necessarily fight the old battles. I mean, China and the US were quite far behind us in telecommunications and, say, 3G standards. So these things keep on changing. You just have to put in the effort into them. The third conclusion I have, apart from a changing economic model and changing policy focus, is a change on the sort of global political scene. And here, some of you might call me an idealist, but I somehow see the emergence of three poles of power, one being China, one being the United States, and one being the European Union. Now, in the public discourse, there's mostly talk about the tensions between China and the US. I would argue that Europe is somewhere in between, and it should actually play the geopolitical game. Now, when I say that there are three poles, by this I mean to simplify and over-rationalize the past. Cold War had two poles, post-Cold War had one, which was the United States. Now we have these three poles. We are not in a multipolar world. I don't think so. But we do have, of course, players who want to be involved. The UK is an example of this. Russia is an example. India is an example. Nigeria is an example. Brazil is an example. These are all too big to ignore, but too small to be called a pole, economically or otherwise. So we're looking at very much, I would argue, a sort of three poles, but trying to find their position. And again, I come to this imperfect notion of what the world is. You can't make a statement or a conclusion and say that one of these poles at the end of the day is going to win. So I want to finish off with the following observation, and I'll stop here. So my thinking on the European Union is that it's more than a state. So it's more than an international organization. It's less than a state. Integration in one area leads to pressure to integrate in another area. It is more of a process than an end state. It is constant crisis management. You move from one crisis to another. And I think its justification often comes from the fact of how is it going to be coping with a crisis. But probably the most fundamental crisis that it has at the moment is a crisis of values. And here we come to Fukuyama's notion of the end of history, and the belief that the best model of society is usually based on three pillars: a liberal democracy, a social market economy, and globalization. The problem is that the liberal democracy, the social market economy, and globalization are all being questioned at the moment. In some cases, they are under attack. I still believe that these are the foundations, the basis of the European Union in a transnational, in an interconnected world. So if we don't manage liberal democracy well and move towards some kind of an illiberal democracy, then I think we're in trouble. That is why the debate between Poland and the member states and the Commission, Hungary, the member states and the Commission, is so important at this particular moment. That is also why I believe that the whole debate that we currently have about a social market economy is important, because we have to be careful that in this sort of frenzy of economic stimulation, of fiscal stimulation, of talks about strategic autonomy, we don't go to old style 1970s type of of industrial policy, where the state is supreme in running a business. And then finally, of course, when we are in this tripolar world, a post-COVID world, if you will, we have to be very careful not to reject what globalization has brought with it. The interesting thing is, of course, and I think Mark Leonard has made this argument very well in his latest book, is that the exact instruments that were supposed to bring us together, so technology, internet, trade, globalization, travel, is actually tearing us apart. And the reason for that is very simple. We're moving away from an ideological world where you had a clear left and right, capitalist, socialist, and somewhere in between, towards an identity-based world. And it's always much easier to debate ideology than to debate your identity. So with these words, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to give you an introduction and warn of the trap of over-rationalizing the past, over-dramatizing the present, and underestimating the future. I wanted to give you an EIPA tour de table from the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, and finish off by saying that, you know, we are in a disruptive world. This is what it's all about. So keep on churning your analysis as you do. I'm very optimistic about the future of the European Union and of EIPA as well. Dank u wel.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for this historical overview and very inspirational thoughts full of hope for the future. We will now move to the first panel. So we'll give 1 or 2 minutes to the panelists to move over here. So please stay seated and bear with us. Thank you.